Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Professor James Otteson. Professor Otteson is a professor of business ethics at the University of Notre Dame. He has written many books, I think about 9 of them, if I'm not mistaken. But today we will speak about his latest book, Seven Deadly Economic Sins, Obstacles to Prosperity and Happiness Every Citizen Should Know. Professor Otteson, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's great to be with you.
So I like the reference to the 7 deadly without the economic sins. And of course, I had to refresh my memory and go back into Wikipedia to see what were those sins and then how they relate to economics. And then I started looking you up, and I found out that your background is in philosophy, not in economics. And I was surprised. So I wonder if we could go a little bit into your past and let us know why is it that you choose philosophy, and then how is it that you made that transition into economics?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And it is a bit of a strange story that somebody with a philosophy PhD could be teaching about economics in a business school. There aren't many people like that. I went into philosophy when I was an undergraduate college student. I thought I was going to become a medical doctor. And then I happened to take a course in philosophy, and I just fell in love. And so I decided to study philosophy. I had no intention to get a PhD or be a professor, but I did well in it. And I thought, well, I would try philosophy graduate school just to see if it was for me. And I really enjoyed that as well. So I studied philosophy in graduate school, and I discovered this person named Adam Smith, who I had heard of, but I heard of him as an economist, but it turned out that he had written a book about moral theory too. It's called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which actually came out before his now much more famous book, The Wealth of Nations. And so on a lark, really, I decided to read that book, and I thought it was fantastic. And so I ended up writing my dissertation on Adam Smith's moral theory. And then, to make a long story short, that got me interested in the general field that Adam Smith was working, and others of the time in the 18th century were working on, called political economy. That's what they called it. And political economy was sort of putting together moral philosophy on the one hand and the principles of economic reasoning on the other. So, what are the moral values we want our society to champion? And then what are the political, economic institutions that might seem to enable us to actually achieve that? And so that became the focus of a lot of my work. And then in the business school, and the reason that really led me to write this book is that it struck me that a lot of people have various kinds of economic beliefs, not because they've studied economics. Most people haven't studied economics. But because a lot of economic beliefs that seem intuitively true, it turns out they're actually fallacies, they're actually mistakes. And that's true for a lot of fields, a lot of other fields too. But I thought that it might be beneficial. And of course, economists disagree about a lot of things, but there are some things that they do agree about. And so I thought it might be useful if somebody who's not a trained economist, but who has come to be a student and an appreciator of economics, to present in a way that non-specialists, not necessarily people with PhDs in economics, but people who want to be educated citizens, who want to understand the way the world works and want to understand what economic reasoning can actually, what it can offer, what help it can provide. For those sorts of people, I thought maybe an introduction to, as I say, some of the 7 deadly economic sins that many of us believe, but it turns out economics has shown aren't actually true, that might actually be beneficial.
Amazing. Oh, let me ask you, what is it at the beginning on your younger years that attracted you to philosophy? And secondly, many people are under the belief that if you study philosophy, you are going to end up working for Starbucks as a barista. So I wonder how much truth there is in that.
Yeah, well, there certainly is that stereotype about studying philosophy. You're right about that. I guess I don't have a good explanation for why philosophy appealed to me. I had, before I went to college, I had no intention, or I didn't really know anything about philosophy, but I had no thought or intention. But it was really reading, I was in a course and we read some Plato, and something about that just resonated with me. And I thought, this is very interesting to try to think hard about what moral virtue, for example, really is, and how do we really know what moral virtue is. I just loved reading philosophy, and I particularly loved one figure in particular. That was David Hume. David Hume was an 18th century Scottish philosopher, one of the greatest in the entire Western canon, I think. And that's really how I sort of accidentally came upon Adam Smith, because I was such a fan of reading David Hume. And then I discovered by accident that he was friends with Adam Smith. And so I thought, oh, well, any friend of Hume's is a friend of mine. And so I decided to read some Adam Smith. So it was really through just a series of accidents. But to your question about what can you do with a philosophy degree? Well, I mean, one thing you can do is become a philosophy professor, of course. But I think there's more than just being able to work in Starbucks. There's nothing wrong with working at Starbucks. But I think one of the things that philosophy does is it trains you in what I think of as the principles of reasoning. So if you're a philosophy major, you're going to spend a lot of time evaluating arguments. What are the premises of the arguments? What are the conclusions from arguments? Do the conclusions actually follow from the premises? And that's a skill that can serve you well in lots of different areas. So I think it's no accident, for example, that philosophy majors tend to score the highest among the highest students on standardized tests like the law school admissions test, even things like the entrance exams to medical schools. They score very highly on those because those tests, in part, not completely, but in part, they test just your reasoning ability. And so if you study philosophy, I think among other things, you can become a much better reasoner, a much more careful reasoner. And I think that can serve you well in lots of areas of life, not just in philosophy, really any field you go into.
Okay, and then you teach business ethics, and I took a business ethics class, I don't know, maybe like 30 years ago. And
Okay.
at that time, and I think even now, business are seen as evil. And at that time,
Yeah.
when I was studying business ethics, we had the example of the apartheid era and how businesses were contributing to the apartheid in South Africa. But of course, there are many examples of how business were taking resources for humanity and just giving it to the just 1%. And then the whole topic of our course was how can business be less evil? And I wonder what what's the new perception, since I haven't taken business ethics in such a long time. What's the perception of today? How society, how you teach business ethics?
Well, you raise a lot of good points, and I think one of the things that contributes to the view that business is evil or needs to atone for its sins, which, by the way, is one of the reasons I called my book what I did, 7 Deadly Economic Sins, partly because of that view that people have that if you are successful in business, for any person who's successful or any company that becomes successful, people tend to think, well, somewhere along the line, you must have done something wrong. There's something you did wrong. And I think, by the way, that's reflected in the pretty common perception, and maybe this is what you're thinking of, but the pretty common perception that that businesses or business people need to give back to society. So you've probably heard people say that you should give back. That's something that struck me when I first started teaching in a business school. That struck me as interesting because, if you think back to when you were a child, if your mother said to you, "Hey, you need to give that back," well, what does that mean you did? It means you stole something. You took something that didn't belong to you, and so you did something wrong, and you need to make amends for it now. And so that raises the question, well, is that what people think about business? Do they think that if you're successful, you must have done something wrong? And I think the answer largely is yes, that is what people think about business. But I would say, and so when I teach business ethics, what I say to my students, and I'll offer this to you for your consideration, but what I say to my students is, I would actually make a different suggestion. Suppose, we look at all the arguments in favor of business, and then we look at all the objections and concerns people raise about business and maybe to a market economy more generally. Suppose after doing all of that, we come to the conclusion that, yes, business is really the sort of thing that you need to atone for afterwards. You need to make up for it afterwards by giving back to society, by giving back. Well, my suggestion is, if that's the conclusion we come to, then we shouldn't ask people or businesses to give back. We should say to them, don't do it in the first place. I mean, you wouldn't say to a thief, well, it's fine to keep stealing as long as some of what you steal you give to charity. You would say, stop stealing.
I would just a small interruption. I come from Colombia, where at the time when I used to be living there were many drug dealers. There was the Pablo Escobar era, and
Oh,
in
yeah.
his little town, he was adored because he was giving back to society. I mean, he sold
Yes.
billions of dollars of cocaine to the United States, but he was giving back to society. So in his town where he grew up, when he was killed, it was one of the most horrible days of that little town. But
Yeah.
okay.
All right, but that's not the only example. So I grew up outside of Chicago, and one of the infamous figures in the history of Chicago is Al Capone. Al Capone, the famous gangster Al Capone. You know, people have made the same. There's a very similar story because Al Capone famously would give money to soup kitchens and for homeless people. He gave money to churches. He gave money to schools. I mean, that raises the question: would you say to somebody like Al Capone, if he's giving you, you're a charity and he's giving you money, would you just say thank you very much, kind sir, and take the money, or should you say, well, how are you getting that money?
Right.
Where did that money come from? And I think it's something very similar with business. So I would say, if it's the case that when business is successful, it's only through ill-gotten gains like that. Then I would say what we should say to people is don't go into business at all. Don't ask them to give to charity or something. Don't go into it. I mean, I think that's a general rule in life. If you whatever you're doing, if you're contemplating doing something, and you're pretty sure before you do it that you're going to have to make up for it afterwards, you're going to have to atone for it afterwards, that's usually a red flag. That usually means maybe you should think about doing something else. So my view about business is that if we're going to continue teaching business, say in a business school, or encouraging students to study it, or maybe even dedicate their lives to it, then there really needs to be a way, I think, that we can describe business such that it's valuable in itself, that it's actually contributing value in its activity, not just to the business person or to the firm, but to other people that you're dealing with. And it has to be simultaneous. You're creating genuine value for all parties. I think there is a way of engaging in business that does create genuine value for all parties. I call it honorable business. But of course, that means there's such a thing as dishonorable business too. And a lot of the stories, and I think probably what I would guess you studied in your business ethics class, and many other people studying business ethics, is the long litany of bad actors. All of the people who did things, or all the businesses who did things badly that we want to condemn. But of course, it's also true that human beings are imperfect creatures, and there are going to be bad actors in all walks of life, not just in business. In any walk of life, you're going to have bad actors. So I think the question is there a way of engaging in business that actually does produce genuine value for everybody concerned? And if there is, I think there is. But if there is, then that's the way to understand business ethics, creating genuine value for everybody.
Yeah, I think in part of the animosity towards business is the income inequality. For example, many of us adore some of the softwares or gadgets that we use every day. Like I don't know anyone who doesn't benefit, for example, from Google and all these Gmails and Google Maps and this and that. But the fact that Larry Page is a multi-billionaire, that bothers a lot of people, in spite of them benefiting directly every day from the products and service created by this billionaire. So I think that's in great part the resistance towards ethics, and then trying to find something evil. How do you earn your money? Who do you screw it? Or how, yeah, well, the evil things that you could find. And well, Larry Page is a huge example, but the local millionaire in your neighborhood, or someone who has, I don't know, a service that benefits society, is doing good by society, but because there's such a disparity, then he is vilified.
Yeah, no, I think you've put your finger on really the what I think is the key moral question. So, when we're thinking about how do we evaluate the moral character of a successful business person, whether the billionaire or the local millionaire, and we want to know, how should we view that person? I think the key question to ask is the one you just indicated, which is, how did that person get the money? Was it through fraud? Was it through extraction, theft? Maybe they got special favors from the government to protect them against competition, or to give them, a special charter or a monopoly, or special, or there were regulations that were created to protect them and shield them from, or impose costs on competitors. There are lots of ways that some business people do become successful, or at least add to their success through those kinds of things. I would call all of those I would call them extraction, meaning I'm benefiting myself, but at somebody else's expense,
right,
rather than what I would call, and by the way, this is actually the first economic sin I talk about in my book, is that it's also the case that people can benefit through what I call cooperation. Meaning, if I'm offering you a service at a certain price and you decide that it's worth it to you, so I give you the service and you give me the money, whatever the price is we agreed on, as long as this was mutually voluntary, I didn't force you and you had other options, there are other things you can do, but you chose to buy from me, then what we can assume is that you must think you benefited from it. To go back to your first example about Starbucks, when you go into Starbucks and you order the double pumpkin spice mocha latte or whatever you order, and the barista says that'll be $5, and you give $5 and you get the latte. Well, if you ask, well, which one of you benefited from that transaction, you or Starbucks or the barista? Well, the answer is both of you did,
right,
because if either one of you didn't, you would have said no thanks and gone somewhere else. I mean, if Starbucks said that'll be $50, you would have said no thanks and you would have gone somewhere else. Or if you said I'll give you 50 cents for it, they would have said no thanks and moved on to the next customer. So when you have a mutually voluntary transaction like that, then that tends to be mutually beneficial. So it's not me benefiting at your expense, it's you and I benefiting together. And that's one of the key parts, I think, of what I think of as honorable business, when yes, I'm benefiting, but only if at the same time you're benefiting. And when you talk about inequality, I think that's the first question you have to ask. Well, how did that person get his or her wealth? Was it through extraction, by fraud, et cetera, or was it through mutually beneficial cooperative transactions?
And there's to extraction. The thing is that there are many examples of extraction as well, and there is example of a business aligning, getting favoritism from government. So when people have all these examples to point their finger at, and then they don't know how to discern between the good and the bad, like you mentioned, then when it's all fuzziness, you can just put everyone in one group. Okay, so you mentioned one of the economic sins. I guess that would be the number one. Wealth is a positive sum. I wonder if you could mention another two, for example.
Sure. So one other one that I talk about is what I call the good is good enough fallacy. Good is good enough. And what I mean by that is, if you're thinking about, say, a proposal for spending, whether it's you spending your own money or maybe, the government spending money on something, if you talk about what good could come about as a result, if we allocate some resources in this direction, here's what the good thing we'll get. And let's suppose that it is a good thing, whatever it is you're going to spend your money on, it's going to lead to a good result. A lot of people think, well, that's the end of the conversation. Then once you've shown that spending money on this program or project or agency or whatever it is, or this for this good or service, if it would provide something good or lead to a good result, then that's reason enough to do it. I think the fallacy there is to forget that there's another piece of the picture. And the other piece that's leaving out is, what could that same amount of money that you're now thinking about spending here, what else could it have done? Because remember, we live in a world of what economists call scarce resources, meaning we don't have all the money in the world. Right. However much money you have, everybody wants more, which means that there are always trade-offs involved. So if I spend my money on a new car, maybe that means that I can't spend that same money sending my child to college. So in fact, this is actually a conversation I had with my teenage son not too long ago, who, once he got his driver's license, he tried to convince me that I should buy a car for him. And so lay it out all the things that if I bought a car for him, here's what it would enable him to do this and with his friends and all, and he could drive himself to school and all of these things. And I said, okay, well, but if I did that, then I probably couldn't pay for you to go to college when you graduate. And he said, oh, right. So, so the good is good enough fallacy is what it leaves out is what economists call opportunity cost, which means what are the other things you're giving up with that money? Right. And I think a lot of discussions, especially on the on the state level or even the national level, about spending proposals. We're going to spend this money in this direction, and here are all the good things we're going to get out of it. And maybe they are good things. I mean, maybe they aren't. I guess we could, we could have an argument about that. But suppose they are good things that you could get out of it. But you always have to remember that that in order to spend money here, you're taking resources from somewhere else. So what you have to do then, I think, is you have to compare the two. So here's the good you're proposing to get if we spend it here. But then we have to also think about what would be the benefit if we had spent it in other ways. And you have to compare the two. So just showing that something leads to a good result doesn't mean it's a good enough result to actually justify spending.
Right. Okay. I wonder if you could talk about the scene, your chapter number 6, equality of what?
Yeah. So that's thank you for asking me that. That's a bit of a controversial chapter or a controversial topic. So, equality is something that almost everybody supports, no matter where you are on the political spectrum or the economic spectrum. Everybody wants equality. But one of the things that I talk about in that chapter, one of the arguments I make in that chapter is that there's more than one conception of equality. There's more than one kind of equality we might want. And here's the problem. The problem is that when you champion one version of equality, that probably comes at the expense of other versions of equality. So say, for example, somebody wanted, what are different kinds? So somebody could say, I want equality before the law. The law treats all people equally. Okay, that's one kind of equality. Or maybe somebody says, I want equality of resources. So everybody shares in all of our resources equally. Or one last one, maybe someone says, well, what I want is equality of benefit. In other words, I want everybody to benefit from society's resources the same. Well, you can't have all three of those. Whichever one of those you pick means you're giving up on the other two. So if you want equality before the law treats everybody equally, well, then you're going to have inequalities in wealth, you're going to have inequalities in benefit, you're giving those up. And same with the other ones. Even take equality of benefit. If you want equality of benefit or maybe equality of welfare, people's personal welfare in life, well, some people are going to need a lot more resources to get equal welfare to other people who need a lot less resources, which means the wealth is going to be unequal and the law is going to have to treat them differently too. So you won't have equality before the law. So one of the arguments I make in that, and really the main point of that chapter, is to say, just saying we want equality doesn't get us very far. Right. You have to say what kind of equality. And then once you pick one, you have to explain why that version of equality, whichever one you want, is more important than the others and is worth trading the others off against it. And that's part of the conversation that I think about equality, the public conversation about equality, that we just never get to. But I think that's really when you get to a serious discussion of equality, is you're understanding that there are trade-offs involved. You can't have everything. We can't have everything in life, alas. I wish we could, but we can't. And so we actually, to have a serious discussion about that, we have to talk about those trade-offs.
I think the robing point is equality of opportunity. If everyone have equal opportunity, but then we also want equality of outcome.
Yes, right. And so, you're not going to get both of those at the same time either.
No, right. That is but that's what people are fighting for. Or I hear those arguments. Well, if the population is X% this and Y% Y, then that should be the outcome, and we're going to even force that outcome because that's what makes logic in my head. So that's right. A big problem point. Yes.
No, I agree. And I think, what I hope anyway is one of the goals of that chapter is to help get some clarity for that discussion. Because I think a lot of times when people are arguing about equality, they're sort of arguing past each other because they're employing different definitions of equality, and maybe they change their definitions of equality in the middle of talking about it. So they're often not productive conversations. But if we start with the idea that you have to pick one version of equality, And you have to understand that any one you pick is going to entail a trade-off against others. Then you can have, I think, a more productive conversation.
Yeah, I guess there are also, let's say, uh, cultural factors that benefit one group of people versus the other one, and then we say, well, because of culture, this group of people have benefited disproportionately versus this other
Right.
group of people. So yeah, I don't want to go into details because that,
Oh, I understand your point, and I think and it's not even just culture. Sometimes even legally, there have been in the past, and there still are in some places in the world today, laws that actually legally prohibit, certain kinds of people from, say, owning property, or from starting a business, or from owning a business, or having clear title to their land. All of those things are obstacles to prosperity, and they all result from treating people differently before the law.
right. Okay. As I was looking into your profile, I think I counted 9 books altogether, and many of them are about Adam Smith.
Yes.
Not just one. I don't know how many, but several of them. And
Yes, I have
just
a few. Yeah.
and then just out of my own curiosity, I don't know if it's a glitch, but one of them right now is for free. As one of Adam Smith's book right now is 0 cents. So
Yes. Yes. You can download
obviously,
it for free. Yes.
you're not doing that for the money.
No, no, that one's actually, that's my most recent Adam Smith book, probably the last Adam Smith book I'll write. But that one is intended for just an educated generalist audience. So not necessarily, professors or scholars or something. But the idea behind it is, what are 10 things that every educated person should know about Adam Smith? And that's what that book is. And it's all in less than 100 pages. So it's an attempt to say, here are the important things about Adam Smith and his ideas in less than 100 pages.
Well, the only thing that comes to my mind is just the invisible hand.
Yes, right. That's usually, if people have heard anything about Smith, it's that phrase. So I do talk about that and what he meant by that phrase, but there are some other interesting ideas he had as well.
Well, Professor, this has been an amazing conversation. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow you or buy the book?
Yes, thank you. So the title of the book is 7 Deadly Economic Sins, Obstacles to Prosperity and Happiness Every Citizen Should Know. It's published by Cambridge University Press, and you can get it from Amazon or from Barnes & Noble, or from going to Cambridge University Press's website. Or you can learn more about it from my own website, which is just my name, jamesotteson.com. And you can also follow me on Twitter.
Right, and all those links will be in the show notes. And one more question. So the Adam Smith book is free just all the time, or just today, or just this week, or
So
as long as Amazon allows you to?
No, good question. Yeah, now, if you want, you can download a digital version of it for free anytime. If you want a hardback, or if you want a physical copy, I think it's $1. But if you want to have a digital copy, you can download it for free.
Okay, well, I recommend the 7 economic sins, but if you want to test Professor Otterson's writing first, then you can get the Adam Smith book for free first. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.